My name is John Chen. I'm the author of a book called Engaging Virtual Meetings, and I'll be your producer today. Just to tell you a little background about this program is that this all started actually as a meeting with Tyler Davidson of Meetings Today magazine, and other people, leaders like Joan Eisenstadt and others have all been talking about what's happening right with Asian Pacific Islanders, especially in the meetings industry. And there's a lot of things that were not supported. You know, we actually have been spending the last 6 months looking about what's happened. So for instance, our group now has become known as APIEventProfs. So EventProfs is actually one of the most well-known hashtags in all of the event professional industry. And nobody in the history of either Facebook or LinkedIn has ever thought to create APIEventProfs. So we did it. So APIEventProfs is what you're here today. We really have been centering a number of programs last year that we started our first program for Stop Asian Hate, and we really wanted to expand on those programs. And so this is actually the first of those expansion programs. And also keep an eye on APIEventProfs. There is both a Facebook group and a LinkedIn group that you can join, as we'll be having a lot of program we're planning for May of 2022. If you didn't know, May is API Heritage Month, and so that's a month where we're coalescing and centering a lot of program. With that, I'm excited that you're here for today's program with Jolene. And let me just tell you a little bit about this program and, of course, about Jolene. Today's program is Aren't Asians All Alike? And so really going to look around being Asian inclusive. One thing that I know about Jolene, number one, and I are the what we thought were the only two extroverted Asians in Seattle for a while, which we know is not true, but we thought that was true. Jolene's been in the meeting industry for over a decade. She's was the CEO of Meeting Maximizers. She's produced over 500 events. She's also been the past president of the Northwest chapter of the Northwest Speakers Association. She did that for 3 years. And something else, if you didn't know, right, social justice is something that's built into Jolene Jang. She actually had something where it was called the upskirt controversy. People were shooting photographs up grates in one of Seattle's events, and there was no law preventing that. So she actually not only had this happen to her, but she took that along with it and got the work done. There is actually now a law passed because of Jolene that prevents this from happening. And so now she's been really focusing her work on Stop Asian Hate. She's educating companies on what they need to do to be Asian inclusive and show how they will be rewarded for it. Everyone put your hands in the air for the one and the only Jolene Jang.
And I have intro music. Oh, that is so fun.
There you go, Jolene.
Cool. Well, thanks, John. And Happy New Year to everybody. And thank you for all of you for being curious and taking the time to be here. And there's lots of things you could be doing, but you choose here, and thanks for the support. So today the program is Aren't Asians All Alike? And please don't answer that. I will ask you later, and you will believe that no, Asians are not alike, and you're going to gain professionally and personally in many ways. So what you don't know could cost you. Isn't that rather intriguing? This presentation provides an overview on how to position your business to capitalize on the fastest growing American ethnic population that is $1.2 trillion in buying power, and while protecting your company from costly discrimination lawsuits. After this presentation, you will know more about historical roots of anti-Asian hate in the United States. You'll be more culturally sensitive to issues that Asians experience, and you'll better understand how to communicate more effectively with Asians. And you'll be able to help your company attract and retain Asian employees and clients. And you're going to see the need and the role of DEI programs, and to make sure that you add an Asian component for creating culturally competent workforce. Now, I did mention that I do have 44 hours that I was really trying hard to squeeze into this, and I can't, which frustrates me. But in this hour, I'm going to do my best to select what's foundational, and I'm sorry that I talk fast. After this presentation, we will have a Q&A and a discussion to talk about it and expand and talk about what we just talked about. And do use the chat. I won't be participating right now, but I will after. But John or Zoom Jockey will be doing that, and do interact with each other. And I'd like to know what your questions are so we can answer them later. And before we get started, this is on Facebook Live somewhere and many places, and YouTube. So I don't know if it's on mine right now, but if it is, you can go to my wall, Jolene Jang, and share it. And before we get started here, I want to give you an idea like where I'm coming from. I'm from Seattle, born and raised. And for decades, for a couple of decades, I've spoken about maximizing meetings and innovation and how to use the power of curiosity to come up with new ideas and new markets. And as John mentioned, I've been behind the scenes planning events, but also in front of the scenes. So in the hospitality industry, I know both sides. And I recently have turned my interest to my focus to Aren't Asians All Alike and Stop Asian Hate because it is a big problem right now. I am Japanese, Chinese, Swedish, and this is my family. So my mom and dad, which are on the call. So my father is Swedish and and Chinese, and my mother is Japanese. And I have been a host mother to 35 international students, all from Asia. And before COVID, I have done lots of focus groups with Seattle Asians and listening to their lived experiences, which are rarely shared. And what I found is that all of them have not had the safe space to talk about being Asian. Now, I know it's hard for you to understand what it's like to be Asian, and that's a silly thing to ask you to do, but think about if there's been a time when you have felt unsafe. Maybe you're traveling and you take an exit and a couple wrong turns. You look around and you're in a different community and people know it. They're staring at you and you feel that uncomfortableness. And so you want to hightail it out of there. Perhaps you're setting up at a conference at a hotel and it's 11 p.m. You have all this stuff and it's this cavernous, dark garage. You think you're alone, but then you hear this kerfuffle and then a cacophony over there. Have you felt unsafe? Likely, you probably haven't felt like that many times in your life. Unfortunately, for Asians, this may be a daily occurrence on their way to work, just at going grocery shopping, and even walking in their neighborhood. And I'm going to share with you why they feel like this. So this is your warning here that if you want to look away for a moment. So this is a minute and it's going to be graphical.
No more. We're not gonna let you hold us down. We're gonna rise up and stand our ground. And we won't keep quiet no more. You lured us overseas, fed us lies so we'd believe that we could have everything you have. And we built your railroad tracks while you walked upon our backs. But in the end, we never got our half. With dynamite and rope put in our hands, all so you could go and take more land.
So this last one that you just saw is just outside of Seattle at a Buddhist temple in Tacoma. And this monk, a nun is being attacked. The senior nun is being attacked by 3 people. And there's an 80-year-old caretaker of the monk who is also attacked. So this is happening every day in communities across the United States. It's not limited to Chinatowns. Many Asians are concerned for our safety because we are targeted. The expressions of hate range from microaggressions to assault to murder. Most Asians are not going to report their hate incidents. In many cultures, we're just told to, keep our heads down, do what's good for the greater good, and nobody wants to hear it. Maintain harmony. So Asians are going to be reluctant to talk up, and that's my network included. I haven't reported mine. My aunt, when she was followed for 10 minutes, didn't report her. When 3 big white guys threatened my dad and says, "I'm going to kill you," my dad did call the cops, but they weren't interested. These are not isolated events. The police don't keep track of these incidents. So Stop Asian Hate org was formed because there was such an alarming escalation of xenophobia. And they recorded over 10,000 hate events. And that is a large number. But really, that is just a tiny fraction of reality. And there was a national survey published last November that said 1 in 5 Asians experience a hate incident last year. That is 5 million Asian Americans who received hate last year. Because people are not aware of this hate, on my website, jolenejang.com, I have a timeline of attacks. So I thought maybe if people saw it and saw videos that they would believe their eyes. And I haven't updated, the last 2 weeks, but there's probably another 10 murders to put in there. So it is happening, and this is a good resource for people who think it doesn't happen. And over the last 291 days, I've been doing what I can to bring awareness with programs like this, because Asians are made to feel like they do not belong. And I wish more Americans would care about other Asian Americans, but my goal isn't to preach my morality. I'm going to give you a reason to care. I'm going to show you why it's smart business to be knowledgeable about Asian cultures, particularly if you're in the hospitality field. So why should you care if you are not Asian? Well, consider this. Asians have the highest income, the highest education level. They're the fastest growing population, and they have a high buying power of 1.2 trillion. Their buying power is approaching of that of the Black and Hispanic populations, which are double and triple the population. So do you want a piece of this market? There are companies like this who are seeing, oh, there is an opportunity. So Oakley, of course, you've heard of, they make Asian fit sunglasses. And in the upper corner, you see there's other sunglasses. This is Maui Gyms in Hawaii. And, Asian fit also, and it's $350. These are not low end. So there is opportunity here. And in the middle, there is Nimble Made, and this is a gentleman's apparel. And, they're, $60, $80 for a shirt. And Pepper is the bra that's made for Asians. And what's kind of funny, I was researching this, and now I get all these ads from all the platforms of these bras. So thanks for the research. So there's a lot of opportunity, and it's underserved. And besides retail, there are some major companies that are paying attention to this who want to cash in on this. Netflix, after George Floyd was murdered, they had put together and popped up their Black stories. And then last May, for Asian Pacific Heritage Islander Month, they highlighted Asian American stories. So it is, things are going, but it's because pressure from the Asians who are in-house and like myself. And you have heard of Shang-Chi, the partnership between Marvel and Disney, and this broke all sorts of records. This film surpassed 100 million in 5 days, the fastest film to reach this milestone since Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. So worldwide, they've grossed $432 million. And think of all the companies who can make out from this with merchandising. So whatever lunch pails, I don't know if they still make those, action figures, costumes, maybe even themed events. So let's go to our first poll and think about, well, how does this affect the meetings industry? So let's take a look there. So let's pull up the poll and ask, what percentage of hotels and motels in the US are owned by Asian Americans? Think about that. And do you work with hotels? Are you a caterer? Are you a meeting planner? Do you do destination management? Do your clients work at hotels? How are you connected to hotels? Okay, and let's take a look here. It looks like the guesses are 30. Most of you are guessing that it is 20%. I would have guessed 10%. The answer is actually 60%. I think that is shocking to me. So follow-up question, what happens in Texas? What do you think the answer is in Texas? And we certainly hear Texas in the news a lot of times. And I particularly hear a lot about the racism in Texas. So how many do you think are Asian owned, American owned in Texas? Interesting. Yeah. So the answer is, a lot of you guessed 40%. The answer is 80%. So now you put this together with this new stat here, with this article. So in the LA Times, by the way, is is Korean owned, while US chains are cutting back on their hotels and they're investing. Japanese and Chinese owned companies are aggressively buying and building new luxury properties in America. So think about this. Currently 60% are already Asian American owned, and then Chinese and Japanese are now owning up all the luxury brands. So where do you want to be? And how are you going to compete? So you got to think about that, because if you don't understand Asian culture, you are not going to get that business. Absolutely not. And let's think of another industry. So just in the chat, write what you think. Which industry has a lot of money, does a lot of launches, does work at hotels, and has a bunch of Asian employees? In the chat, go ahead and answer that. Yep, exactly. And yeah, tech, of course, is tech. And in Silicon Valley, they're 50% Asian. So where do you think they're going to spend their money? They're going to spend their money where they feel safe and respected. So let's look at tourism for a second here. This is Asians visiting America. It's 12 million visitors from Asia every year for the last 5 years. Now, when that picks up again, where do you want to be? The Japanese and Chinese are buying up those luxury hotels because they're like, yeah, Americans don't really know how to sell to us, but we know how to sell to us. So how do you want to capitalize on this Asian market? How do you do it? Well, it begins with your training. Let's pop this over here. So let's talk about the evolution of diversity and training. Just pull out of the way. So it started off for 50 years. It began because of the civil rights in 1964. And it was about legislation and compliance to save from getting sued. And there's African Americans are speaking up and in the workforce. And so, hey, let's not get sued. And then in the 80s, with the Reagan Revolution and all this deregulation, they are like, you know what? Okay, we may not get sued, but so let's try and get the new populations, like the women and LGBT who are now in the workforce. Let's just get them to assimilate. Let's have them be like the dominant culture, the white male culture. And then up to the 2000s, so the impact of global and migration. So now we are diverse. So the idea is to actually be competent and learn skills. And where are Asians on this? Well, I think we're adding them right now. And I'm hopeful. So think about your DEI's program. What phase are you in? Is it evolving? And or is it more at compliance? Because if you want to be successful, you can't just be a checkbox situation. So does your diversity program address Asian Americans, or are you just grouping them with 100 other countries, people from other countries, under the title of people of color? So there are a handful of progressive tech companies that are starting the DE programs, but we're hoping for more. So tell your friends. Government is recognizing the impact of Stop Asian Hate, and Biden signed a Stop Asian Hate bill last year, and it was a fantastic speech. I was crying. I was just, oh my gosh, he really understands. It was really well written. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission said that they will use all the tools in the agency to combat anti-Asian hate and racism. And locally, there were 26 governors who signed on acknowledging that they do need to combat Asian hate. So what are you going to do? First, we need to learn to recognize the expressions of hate. What I'm going to do is share with you the current climate for Asians in America. And remember that 1 in 5 Asians have been impacted in this last year. And your Asian employees and clients are impacted. And you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is, if you can't recognize it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what it looks like and how to recognize it. It can be overt, or it can be subtle. And it's not just seniors, it's not just women, it's not just men, it's kids too. And you may be surprised that it is also professional athletes and Olympiads, and also Suni Lee. So let's explore the ways that on a daily basis, what your employees, your Asian employees and friends may be going through. So let's just take a peek here. So just on a daily schedule. So here's a sign, kill all Chinese people. And construction sign with a rice paddy hat and start Asian hate. License plate that says Asian flu, basically blaming Asians for COVID. This is in Seattle, Chinatown. And with these First National, these are white supremacist signs. And this Japanese American got some coffee, came back out to her car, and there's a cup of urine that says die, kill, die. How would you feel if somebody had these words towards you and you know that Asians have been attacked and murdered? Yeah, scary. And simply, on a daily basis, going to the store, to CVS, to FedEx, to fast food, they all say ching chong. And if I were picking up some food that said ching chong, I don't believe that that person didn't spit or do something bad in it. And this letter was mailed to this widow celebrating the death of her husband and saying, yeah, one more or less Asian to worry about. Watch out. So there's many ways. Oh, and this lady, she was just walking down the street and she was set on fire. And this Cambodian gentleman and also his Asian neighbor, their cars were torched. Their neighbors were not, but they are Asian. So are you seeing? Here I am. Hello. Are you seeing how hate is coming from all different directions? And we didn't even talk about subtleties. So it is very stressful just on the daily things that we do. I don't walk alone. I do not walk alone. I don't go to the store alone. I don't do anything alone. And some of you know who I am. I'm kind of a tough gal here. So it's very stressful. So when I went bike riding this last summer, so basically my friend thought nothing of this, but what I remembered was this. I remembered when this guy, this Asian, he was cut up by hacksaw and put in a bag by these three guys. So that was my memory of what happened. Have you heard of any of these Asians who were killed? No, you probably have not, because all the bandwidth was taken up by missing white woman syndrome, Gabby Petito. It's stressful. So think about your employees. There's a lot going on there. So when you think about, oh, it's not a big deal, I don't see it. Even if your Asian friends or employees were not attacked, they feel it. And they may need to change their walking routes and rethink how they do transportation. And we also have to be careful when we cough in public. True story. And think about these Asian employees. Do you know them? Do you know their ethnicity or how they identify? Do you know their family? How much do you know about your culture? Because we're a lot of times not told to talk about our culture. Hey, just go along. We're all the same. There's a lot of work to be done. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So remember this as you decide what you want to do and how you want to be. Hate is not new. It's been happening since Asians immigrated to the US, but since then, it feels like the attacks have been blatant and normalized. So now you have this wide range of hate, and understand a little bit better, practice being aware and recognizing it. So now let's talk about the history of hate and then address how to gain access to the market by also being inclusive. So when it comes to developing a cultural competency, 3 elements are important. So knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So you want your program to be able to teach employees about other cultures and make them aware of any implicit biases and train them to communicate effectively. It's what we're going to do here is first learn about Asian cultures, and then we're going to do a brief historical background of Asian immigration to America to put our discussion into context. Then we're going to address perceptions and attitudes towards Asians. Now, our American education system doesn't include Asian Americans. Most children have not heard of the Japanese of Asian Americans at all, but they may have possibly had a paragraph about the Japanese internment camps. I don't recall learning about them. I know that I did a paper on them because I was president of the Asian Club, and I thought, let me learn. And so I talked to my relative who was willing to talk about it when he was in the camp. So I'm going to highlight a few historical events from the perspective of a Japanese, Chinese, Swedish power tool wielding, swing dancing culture explorer from Seattle. It's hard to believe that all Asians are categorized into one bucket. So I have a question for you. We have a little poll here. How many countries are there? 21, 36, 48, 67, 72. Now, if you asked me maybe 8 months ago to name Asian countries, I'd probably be able to come up with 12. So I'm learning a lot as well. And we can't cover all the immigration from these countries because we do not have time. But we're going to talk about Japan and China, just totally coincidental that I'm Japanese and Chinese. And after this brief timeline, you'll get a grasp of how people have perceived Asians over time. And you'll see that there's been a lot of animosity towards Asians historically, and you'll understand why. So, wow. Okay. I'm impressed. A number of you guessed correctly. Yeah, there are 48 countries. Not bad, not bad. Now, how many can you name? All right. Next question is, no, don't. Did you see that? From which Asian country did the first Asian person arrive? And we have a poll on this one. So my father and I went to Seattle, Chinatown about 4 years ago. I had no idea. My answer was wrong. And this group seems to be really assimilated. So what is your answer here? Oh, 33% are, okay, it's neck and neck. So the answer is from the Philippines. So there was a Filipino sailor who came over in 1587. By the way, Filipinos are the third largest Asian ethnic group, and they have the second highest income of the Asians. So let's go to our timeline. So Filipinos arrived in 1587, but the main settlement was in Louisiana in 1763. And then the next wave here was for the gold rush. So we have the Chinese were fleeing the Opium Wars. And so they were miners, and they worked for themselves and others. And in 1852, there was 20,000 Chinese immigrants in California. That's nearly 30% of all the immigrants. And white miners were not pleased. They don't like Chinese. They were resentful. And so what they did was basically they fought back with violence and legislation.
Tonight, something that doesn't happen too often at KSDK, a social post about one of our newscast segments has gone
Wait, what is that?
And the attention
of can somebody mute?
Like NBC News, CNN, Newsweek, and the
Do you hear that?
Post.
The reason it's opening the conversation about
that's not mine.
Represent.
Okay, thank you. So, that is go to the smaller one. Okay, here we go. Got it. Okay, back on track. So what they did, because they didn't like Chinese, is they had anti-discrimination laws and violence. So that includes the foreign miner's license. So it was $20 that the Chinese person or the person who employs a Chinese person. And that actually was about the wage that they earned at that time. And of course, Chinese were robbed and they were also murdered. And then there was more legislation where Chinese were no longer able to testify. So what happened next is in 1865, the U.S. railroads recruited Chinese So what happened is these railroads were being built, and the Pacific Railroad Company needed to recruit 5,000 for the toughest part of track, but they couldn't get any. The white immigrants definitely did not want to do this. And so even though they referred to the Chinese as dregs and degraded people, white people didn't want to hire them, but they needed the labor. The conditions were treacherous. They were daunting, and what they did was they were digging tunnels. Small Jolene, there we go. And the temperatures in the summer were 120 degrees to freezing, and there was 44 storms in one season. The Chinese, they made less and they worked harder. So Chinese were paid half to 2/3 the rate of the white immigrants, which was $1 a day. And unlike the white immigrants, they actually had to pay for the lodging and their food. So they dug tunnels and 1,776 miles of track. And for every 2 miles of track, 3 Chinese died. And here's a question for you, and you can just answer in the chat. At the completion of the railroad, what percentage was built by Chinese? Okay, I have a couple of guesses. Okay. Oh, these are good guesses. Oh, these are Asian allies speaking. That's why. Yeah. It looks like you're right in there. So the answer is 80%. 80% built. And then when you look at this picture, by the way, there are no Chinese. This was a celebration, and look at the work we did, but Chinese were not invited. So what was next is, so the railroads were done. So there's no use for Chinese. The white employers got their cheap labor and they hate Chinese. So they're done with them. So thus the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was the first law to prevent a specific group from immigrating to the United States. And it lasted for 60 years. So what do you think the impact on the Chinese that were actually living here? Do you think people were like, oh yeah, we still like them? No, this was the driving out period. You can imagine how much more this would have ignited hate. Mobs robbed and chased and killed them. And there were Chinese massacres. So a mob in LA, there were 500 white men entered LA, Chinatown, to attack and loot and murder. And they murdered 10% of the Chinese population. And here, there's just so many depictions, encouragement to Chinese immigration. And the anti-Chinese hatred became so normalized that it even was incorporated into advertising, selling washing machines. It says we have no more use for them, meaning Chinese, because we have this washing machine. So here we are today. Sorry, we don't accept Chinese customers. Again, today, this year, become a Kung Flu fighter. So instigating violence. So yeah, again, we have all this violence aimed at Chinese and other Asians. So let's look at the next wave of immigrants. So we have Japanese, the Chinese Exclusion Act that opened the doors because the United States needed cheap labor again. And so Japanese were recruited from Japan and Hawaii to replace the Chinese. So from 1901 to 1908, there was 127,000 Japanese. And a lot of them were farmers. My Japanese grandfather came over in 1912. So the Chinese were hated and the Japanese were recruited until they were hated a couple of years later. So they showed the hate through the California land law. So basically it says, hey, you were really good at farming, Japanese folks. So we're going to make sure that you can't own land. And then 1924 is the federal immigration ban, where this bans Japanese. It says just people, but it's enforced with Japanese. So then we have the World War II, and I hope you have heard of the executive order um, that says that all the Japanese need to evacuate the West Coast. So Japanese Americans were forced to leave. Let me leave here. I just left. To leave their stores, their farms, their businesses, and everything they own, except for one suitcase. They would be shipped and incarcerated in relocation centers where they lived in horse stalls with other families and with sheets for walls and pillows out of straws. And here, and this is in my parents' era. So here's a Jap hunting license. So its season is now open, no limit. Remember Pearl Harbor. And like you may hunt a moose or something and put the head on the wall, here's another Japanese license. So this is no joke. Here's an example of a bunch of them. So there was a lot of hate here. Oh, and I wanted to show that this was Dr. Seuss. I think, Dr. Seuss made the news not too long ago. And yeah, he had a lot of hate. And this is during World War II. So slap that Jap and then bring it up to today, Twitter. This is, 2021, slap an Asian challenge. So this is where teenagers got together and slapped an Asian. So hate has not gone away. And this is, by the way, this is my my mom's family. So my mom is there in the center and my grandparents. And I'd like to ask you, if you can put the poll out there, I'm curious how many of you know a Japanese American? I think that so many people believe that, oh, slavery was so long ago and the Holocaust so long ago. Did it happen? Japanese incarceration, ancient history. Because people don't have connection to it. But if you are second to fourth generation, because first generation is dead, Japanese American, then they will know or be related to somebody who was incarcerated. So I want to let you know that it's not that long ago. And okay, all of you know a Japanese American. Well, that's good. I guess you all know me. Well, I encourage you, if they're a friend, you can ask them about their relatives. Don't push, just be like, oh, I'm curious. I was on this program and this Japanese American encouraged me to ask. You can position it that way because there's a lot of stories out there. And if not, there's podcasts and I have resources for you. So hate has not gone away. I want to talk to you and you can see me now and bigger. There I am. Hate hasn't gone away and attacks on Asians have increased. And I want to talk about two different stereotypes that are perpetuated by the media that have a profound impact on attitudes towards Asians. So the first stereotype involves perceptions of what it means to be American and an unconscious belief that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. For decades, Harvard University has been measuring attitudes using an instrument called implicit association tests. And I think you've all heard of this. And you can take this online and learn if you have implicit attitudes that you did not know about. For example, you may believe that women and men should be equally associated with science, but your automatic associations could show you, and like many others, that you associate men with science more than you associate women. So between 2007 and 2020, over 336,000 people took the tests that measured the associations between the concepts of Asian and American. And the results showed a subconscious belief that Asian Americans are more likely to be perceived as foreigners. However, over 13 years, there was a steady decline in that trend. So let's take a look at that. So what happened, there was a study published last year in the Journal of Health, Education and Behavior revealed a reversal in the trend beginning in 2020, following the increase in stigmatizing language in conservative outlets. So on March 8th here on the little picture, there was an increase of 650% of Twitter retweets saying China virus and like terms. The next day, there was an increase of 800% increase in the news conservative media articles. So in the 3 weeks after March, the levels of implicit bias against Asians increased enough to offset more than 3 years of prior declines. So it was going well, but then boom, reverse. This research provides evidence that the use of stigmatizing language increased subconscious beliefs that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. And remember, during this period, that's when the Atlanta shootings, the 6 Asian spa workers were shot. Words do matter. And media is influential. So question, how do you perceive Asians? So let's pull that poll out, get the poll out and say, how many of you have asked, where are you really from? And this is anonymous, so don't worry about your answer. This is just, it's all good. So no matter why you were asking it, because maybe you want to sit down and have a 2-hour conversation and really get to know that person. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you're categorizing them. But either way, particularly right now, that is not a question to ask because it implies that you don't see them as American. And this video, you may have seen this video. This is out in 2013. I believe it's Ken Tanaka. It has 10 million views. And what kind of Asian are you? And it demonstrates, kind of why that matters. And on this next video, I'm going to play for you a little bit of it. Matt Arfact, he talks about where you really from. And I think this should be used in educational programs. It is brilliant. So let's play this here. Oh, by the way, how many have you asked where you really from? Okay, we have 78% who say no. Well, okay, sure. So let's play this.
What's your heritage?
What are you?
You don't look American.
But where are you really from?
Here we go again with that, where you really from? How many times have I had this same conversation? Probably at least 1,001. Why should I have to tell my whole family history to anyone at all just cause they're dumbfounded by the fact that my face don't match their idea of a typical American? If I were white Caucasian, yeah, I wouldn't go this way, but I'm mixed race Asian, which means when I say I'm American, born and raised in the USA, that they just pause, searching their mind for the words to be able to say.
No way, but you can't be. I'm gonna refuse to believe it. I mean, an American is Asian. I just can't conceive it. You know, it just doesn't seem quite right. You must be mistaken because American means white, except that it doesn't.
Oh, he's so talented. I just can't wait. I tried to get him on. Oops. I wanted to get him on SNL and other places. So I also got his backstory and talked about his heritage and how he identifies he's Korean and white and inspiration of some of these songs. And so I'll send an email out for those of you who have your emails from Evite. If not, send me an email, Jolene@jolenejang.com, and I'll share references to these things I'm talking about. So did you see this in the news? A few weeks ago, Taylor Greene referred to Asian Americans as yellow people. So what she doesn't understand is that Asian Americans find that term offensive. And it contributes to reinforcing the stereotype of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. So just to bring this back, remember we talked about in the historic history, yellow peril, yellow terror, yellow belly, which is the coward, yellow journalism, which is exaggerated. And in China, yellow movies are pornography. So let's talk about how yellowface and how TVs and movies perpetuate stereotypes.
For a solid 2 decades, the Chinese detective character Charlie Chan was played by white men in makeup. But that was the 30s and 40s, right? Well, here's Jim Sturgis and Hugo Weaving reincarnated as Koreans for parts of Cloud Atlas.
Who are you?
Everyone remembers Mickey Rooney's infamous 1961 performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's as just fully unacceptable and racist, right?
Mr. Go right through.
Well, 20...
Yes. So, aren't you surprised? Like, I thought that yellowface was inappropriate, like blackface. But no, blackface is inappropriate, but yellowface is still okay. So here is an example of...
For a solid 2 decades, the Chinese detective character Charlie Chan was played...
I just pulled up some of the latest movies from 2007 to 2017 that have yellow face. And another term is called whitewashing.
Arguably worse than white people playing Asian characters is white people playing real-life Asian humans, which is what happened to Cora Lyjek in Argo, and to Jeffrey Ma, who appeared in the movie 21 as this character, even though in real life he was this guy.
Ben Campbell was the most gifted student at MIT.
It's not surprising that directors want to hire big names to attract producers and funding, but when they want to do stories about Asians and won't cast Asian actors, they should know that the blowback against that has been building for the better part of a century.
So whitewashing, Asian Americans are seen as foreigners. So when there's a real story about a real Asian, they rob them and take their story away and replace it with a white character. That's maddening. In media in Hollywood do such a great job with this. The other stereotype is the model minority myth. And in 1966, the New York Times article was pitting Japanese Americans against Black Americans, stereotyping Japanese Americans as a successful, industrious, exceptionally law-abiding, while portraying Black Americans as part of the problem minority group, unable to overcome histories of discrimination. When the Japanese were incarcerated, they got over it. Why can't them? So many people say, well, what's the problem? The stereotypes of Asians are positive. It's smart, it's math, it's obedient. But I'll share with you why it's harmful. It masks the disparities. Remember that there are 48 countries. And for example, when we look at this, well, let's look at income. So yes, Asians make the most, like the Indians make the most, but then the Burmese make the least. So it is the biggest income gap. And so if you're thinking, oh, crazy rich Asians, yes, but what about the other ones who are refugees and had to start at the bottom, and so they don't get their services? There are many problems with that. And for example, in New York, 1 in 4 Chinese are under the poverty line. And there is also pressure to meet expectations. So I interviewed, there was 15 teenagers, female teenagers from the East Coast. And it was a really good interview. And they talked about the pressures. They were not accepted. They felt ugly, et cetera. And they also had pressure to be the smart person. And people wanted to, they wanted to cheat from them. They wanted to like, oh, you're smart, right? And, they already feel like an outsider. And so they have all these pressures to meet expectations. It's really sad. And Asian American college students have high levels of high levels of suicide attempts. So there are many problems with this. And then just to speak to Asian Americans are promoted less. Because they're seen as quiet and obedient, they're not seen as leaders. And that's called the bamboo ceiling. So media has been perpetuating negative stereotypes for a long time, but there is some bright hope there. There's these little gems that happen maybe once a month or so. Sesame Street. So the first time, I think it was in 50 years, there's some really good podcasts about this, that they introduce an Asian. So this is a Korean character by a Korean puppeteer. And they launched it on Thanksgiving. And it's such a good, it's so good. I encourage you to watch it. But there's also backlash. The president of CPAC called to defund PBS for introducing an Asian character. Why you got to talk about race? So there's that. So PBS is promoting diversity because that is the new trend. And in 2045, white people will no longer be the majority in America. Smart companies are positioning themselves to gain from this polycultural market. So you should too, right? There are many companies that are starting to do this. Twitter, Airbnb, some of the progressive ones. So what can you do to position yourself? Well, you certainly need to create this welcoming environment. You need this Asian American component to add to your DEI program. So your program should make sure to increase self-awareness of unconscious bias, like we talked about, recognize and stop microaggressions, encourage and foster empathy and allyship, and celebrate diversity. It is, we don't have time to talk about that, but it's really fascinating and very fun. So to be effective, this is not a one-day checkbox, hey, I did it. Asian inclusivity should be integrated into policies and procedures. It should, at the city of Seattle, for example, each department has a diversity committee. So decisions are ran through this diverse group to look for problems before they make the decision. Inclusivity should really be threaded through all the aspects of the business until it becomes the culture. It's like, oh, it's what we do. That's who we are. It's part of the brand, not one and done. So when you design your Asian cultural training, it's important to have somebody who has some firsthand experience, because when you're talking about race, teaching from books is not the same as lived experience. When I consult with organizations, I share how to set up programs that will be lasting and embedded in your culture. So of course, standard programs like assessments, cultural history, customs, nonverbal communication, blah, blah, blah. But I also introduce people to frameworks for understanding and appreciating cultural differences. You may have heard of shame and pride cultures versus guilt and justice, high context versus low context, collectivism and individualism. Because Asia includes 48 countries. It's a big group, but if you can start to have some frameworks to try and bucket a few of them to be able to look at it. So we start there. And the point is really, I teach people the value of different perspectives and to be able to process and reflect before reacting and to see the differences as advantages. There's an interview I did with another mixed guy who is an actor. And there was a moment in there where he talks about seeing the advantages. He always was made fun of, et cetera. But then he saw Jason Momoa and a couple of like Asian stars, he's younger than me, to like, oh, it's an advantage being mixed. Oh, it's an advantage. So learn to shift that mindset. A couple of skills I focus on is reducing stress and anxiety that accompanies interacting with individuals from other cultures, because that's a barrier to communication. So we want to remove those barriers. For example, if we assume that, let's say, emotion from people from the Far East, that they're lacking emotion, well, I explain how Asian expressions of emotions differ from others. Something as simple as eye contact. Particularly Koreans and Japanese. And let's say hugging, for example. So all my friends are huggers, but unless you're a hot dude, like I don't really need to hug you. I just, so it could be misinterpreted that I don't like them. No, I just don't really do hugs. It's not, I didn't grow up with a bunch of touchy feely and definitely no PDA. It's just not part of my culture. And I'm fourth generation, so I've been here a while. Another example is if you're in Texas and your market analysis says, hey, you know what, there's a large Vietnamese population and we have products and services for them, then we would tailor your training to meet the needs of that market, which is going to be very different than marketing to Hmong in Wisconsin. Because you got to remember, Asians are not all alike. Here's something simple you can do today to show respect to your Asian employees or clients, or maybe a way to show, like, to a new client, pronounce their name correctly. When they say, oh, just call me Amy, make an effort to say, you know what? If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to try and say your name. If you can share with me how to say that, because it's part of our identity. And again, when I interviewed these teenagers, yes, part of their name. And there are a number of episodes about saying your name correctly. So if you can take the time to do it, make the effort, it makes a big difference. When I was in South Africa, I couldn't pronounce his name and I didn't understand it or anything. So this is what I did.
And what is your name?
Jolene.
Do it again.
Jolene. Jolene.
Oh, do it again. Let's look at your mouth.
Simple. Jolene.
So the idea is, make the effort and ask permission. Can I record you saying your name? Is that okay? I mean, here, you have to be like me, but like, can I see your lips? But, and after practicing over a month or so, many times, it's Sutu and, Kolani. So it's you have to click, and I was a percussionist. So maybe and I do know Dougie Fresh, so maybe something happened, but, practice, show that you're making the effort, even if it doesn't sound at all like what it's supposed to, you are showing that effort. And they may say, no, thanks, but just call me Amy. So just little things like that make a difference. And let's talk about food for a moment.
And what is your name?
I was so pleased with myself for making this meal. But why would you not want to serve this, let's say, to a Japanese audience? Or to a Chinese audience? Well, the problem is this is mixed. And my Ethiopian friend was here, and I'm like, you know what? I better make sure to explain what is what, because I don't want to miseducate, because we have miso soup in the corner, which is Japanese. We have kimchi, which is Korean. We have seaweed salad, which is Japanese, and the dumplings that are Chinese. And then the pickled ginger is Japanese, and then the Korean bean sprouts. And if you want to look like you know something and you've taken the time, then learn something as simple as food, because otherwise it looks like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. And please do not miseducate your non-Asian audiences. When I see Korean teriyaki, it makes me so mad. So anyways, there's that. So ongoing, at your company, we could also do creative things like this where we work with food. Ongoing learning can be monthly, weekly, Zoom discussions, exercises, challenges, Ask an Asian. And I also set up listening sessions. Being inclusive isn't just gaining knowledge. It's about acting on the knowledge. It's taking a risk, making mistakes, and doing it again, and creating a safe place for people to make mistakes. And I can also help you set this up. What I've done, and I'm not on the screen, what I've done is I've set up 2 groups. So this is Empowered Asians. I was finding that there was no place for Asians to talk. We have to code switch all the time. Like, oh, I don't want my white friend to feel bad, or she gets stressed if I said this, so I just say nothing. And so there's a big need for this. So I particularly in the workplace, and I've also set up Asian Allies, and this is a place where you can practice. It's non-Asians. I mean, Asians are allowed to, but it's really a safe place to make mistakes where we can learn. Because if you're afraid to make a mistake, you're just not helpful. And what we do in these groups is we can discuss things like this, like that are timely and relevant. During the Olympics, we talked about this collective collection, Barbie collection. And so it's like 4 white girls and a Black woman with, kind of like white hair, black, it's just like, how is this inclusive? And in Tokyo. And just the other night at our weekly meeting, we talked about the Very Asian hashtag and how that came out. So again, learning about any kind of culture, particularly Asian culture, it's ongoing. It has to be embedded, and it can be really fun. So, oh yes, I'm saying this. Yeah, fun, because I was a fun specialist. I think I'm still fun here and there. And I think when it is fun and we do these competitions and interactions, then people can remember it more. So before I conclude, and before our Q&A or discussion, John, I really want to thank you for setting this up, and with also Tyler from Meetings Today for promoting this, and APIEventProfs. And also John is very skilled with producing meetings. He's the Zoom jockey, but like high level. And so when I conclude, he's going to share with us just a little bit of what he does to make this magic happen. So at the start of the program, I asked a question. And that question was, yeah, aren't Asians all alike? By now, you better know the answer. The answer is no. And really, we've only scratched the surface of how diverse we are. There are 23 million Asian Americans. So you have the countries of origins, you have the generations of Americans. Again, like I'm 4th generation, there are 6th generation, there's mixed, there's adoptees. By the way, on Netflix, there is a documentary called Found that talk about these Chinese adoptees. And also with the different generations, the Far East, Deep South, Larissa Lamb, she put it's award-winning documentary together about her husband's family from Mississippi, and talks about the Chinese and Black friendship over the generations in the 1800s. So learn about Asian cultures. It really is enriching. And I think it's a conversation starter as well. And remember, what you don't know could cost you. You may not know that your employees or you are using microaggressions, and you don't know that they're offensive, and it could cost you, your customers, and perhaps a lawsuit. And you may not know that your workplace is unsafe for Asians. And you also may not know that you're interpreting your Asian client's body language. So, but you do know now is the financial benefit of appealing to the Asian market. And you can do small and big actions. And a tiny effort can move mountains. And I challenge you to make these tiny efforts, and I can help you. Remember, Asians are not alike. John, back to you.
Excellent. Everybody, let's give a round of applause for Jolene Jang. You can find out more information at Jolene Jang.